Okay, so a big question within developmental psychology has been, how is language acquired? Okay, and again, here we're not talking about whether you speak English or Spanish or French, but the actual ability to communicate through language. Now, this is actually one of the topics that has fallen under the nature versus nurture debate. And so that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to look at the two different sides of that, starting with the nature argument or the biological argument, which in general is suggesting that language is the result of biology. Now, the big person on this side of the argument has been Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist. So he proposed initially that humans have this thing called a language acquisition device that provides us with an innate mechanism for learning language. Okay, now this is not an actual part of the brain. He wasn't saying that it's a part of the brain. Instead, you can think of this as a framework. Right? And as we're exposed to language as children, that gets fitted into this framework. So he was arguing that this is what prepares us to learn language, is what makes us ready to learn language. He then extended this theory further into the universal grammar theory, where he's proposing that we're born with a set of building blocks for learning language that are common to all humans. Okay, so this is really focusing on the genetic component of language development, and it's saying that it's the same no matter where you are in the world. These building blocks that we're born with are the same. So the difference here, the language acquisition device is arguing that, or he's suggesting, is this thing we have that it's a framework that makes us ready to learn language, whereas the universal grammar are these actual building blocks that all humans have for then learning language. So they're kind of the underlying biological processes that go into language development. Now, there is evidence for this theory. Primarily, if you look at it, children all over the world seem to learn language in a fixed sequence at about the same time periods. Now, if language development was simply the result of the environment, then we would see a lot more variation in that. But the fact that it's the same, regardless of which language you're learning and where you're learning it, and what practices are used in teaching language, you see this fixed sequence. Then moving on to the nurture argument, I wanted to make another comment about that, but I'll come back to it. So the nurture argument is suggesting that language development is the result of our environment. We learn it. And the main psychologist on this side of the argument is B.F. Skinner, who, remember, is a behaviorist, and he suggested that language is learned in the same way everything else is. So we observe other people, and if you remember, B.F. Skinner was the one that proposed the idea of operant conditioning. So he applied this to language too. As we're learning language, we're told, yeah, that's correct, or no, you're getting this wrong, and through that process, we learn how to use language. Now, the problem with this theory is if it's correct, it doesn't quite explain how we learn grammar. Because if you think about it, no one ever really sits us down, at least while we're young, and tries to teach us the rules of grammar. And yet somehow we develop this understanding of it. So for example, you're not taught how to put words together in a certain order or how to make something plural. And if you actually think about how you would teach someone that, it's extremely difficult. But yet we develop this understanding. So not only does this go against the nurture argument, it also helps by providing support for the nature argument, specifically Chomsky's theories, that we are already born with these building blocks, including grammatical building blocks. Now, there is some support for the nurture argument. Well, that's quite a lot. Oh, sorry, one second. So this brings us to Jeannie. Please do make sure you watch the video because I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail about Jeannie's case. But it's here and it's provided in the lecture notes. So very briefly, Jeannie was a girl who was isolated for the first 13 years of her life because her parents locked her up in a room and this happened in LA. And during that time, she was never really exposed to language. So if the nurture argument is correct, then that would suggest that she should not have the ability to use language because she wasn't exposed to it. And when they found her when she was 13, that is what they found. She did not have the ability to use language, so that is supporting this nurture theory. If a child is not exposed to language, then they're not going to learn it. However, what they found is when they tried to teach her language, she was able to learn words, but she never formed an understanding of grammar. Okay, she was never able to put those words together into a sentence. Now, this suggests two things. One, it's suggesting that there is a critical period for language acquisition. So a critical period in general is or are specific time frames in which an organism is sensitive to environmental factors. So in general, there are these critical periods for learning certain skills, or where we're most sensitive for developing those skills. In relation to language specifically, this is suggesting that if a child does not learn grammar or is not exposed to language during this critical period, then they lose that ability to do so. So every book I've looked at says a different thing. You see some say that it's around 5 or 6 is this critical period, you need to learn it by then. Others will say 12, 13. 13 definitely seems to be one of the cutoffs because Jeannie was 13 and could not acquire this understanding of grammar, but it's likely much younger. So the second thing that is then doing is supporting this idea that nature plays a role. Yes, she needed to be exposed to language in order to be able to communicate and to learn language. That's supporting the nurture argument. But the fact that she couldn't develop grammar and that there's this critical period, that's suggesting that biology is playing a role. Biology is determining, yes, that you need to be exposed during this specific time in order to fully acquire an understanding of language.